What's up, Faithful? You're listening to another episode of the 49ers Web Zone No Huddle podcast, a part of the Odyssey Network. I'm Brian Rennick. I am solo today, meaning that there is no Al, but I am thrilled to have on a friend of the show and 49ers Twitter legend, Akash. Akash, thanks for joining me today. How are things going for you, man?
Appreciate you for having me, first of all. Super kind there. I'm doing well, man. It's been, like almost 4 or 5 months since the 49ers Super Bowl, and it was nice to kind of get away for a couple months, at least personally.
For
I
sure.
felt like last season probably took the biggest toll in terms of like you were really invested. You're always invested, but it felt like they were going to get it done. And I think when you come away from a loss like that, just to think about like, damn, they got to climb the mountain from the start all over again. And so it's nice just to get a couple months away just to recharge, even as a fan, or a content creator like yourself.
Yeah.
And, just get ready for the season.
Yeah, 100%. Al and I have talked since that fateful day. One of the things that felt most difficult in processing that loss was it felt like it was theirs for the taking. Last season felt like the season, right? It just felt not predestined, but it just felt like everything fell right for them.
That's right.
They faced a Chiefs team that was obviously still good enough to win the Super Bowl, but not as powerful as they had been in the past, at least on offense. And it just felt like this was the time. And then to have it end like it did in overtime, just a real kick to the balls, if you will. And honestly, like you talked about taking time away. It genuinely has felt like a lot of fans have taken time away from. Again, you and I are both on 49ers Twitter. It just felt like people took it a lot harder than even the 2019 loss, or even the
100%.
The NFC Championship game loss to the Eagles. It really felt like people made a concerted effort to be like, you know what, I'm not consuming 49ers news, content, whatever. I got to take a step back. And I get it. It's tough. The other thing I think that makes it a different offseason is that this is the first one that we haven't had a lot of quarterback talk, which a lot of times can drive a lot of content, a lot of engagement, things like that. But the one thing that has been big, and Al and I have talked about it a lot. Al has talked about it. He's done some solo shows and he's had to talk about it, even though he says, I don't want to, and I get it. But it is the Brandon Aiyuk situation. The newest news dropping that earlier this week, Aiyuk did meet with the 49ers, a meeting that, according to sources, was called by Aiyuk. It came out, I think it was yesterday, is either yesterday or today, from Tom Pelissero, that the meeting went well. What has been your take on the Brandon Aiyuk situation in terms of what you think is going to happen, why you think there maybe is a little bit of a gap between what the 49ers want to give him and what you think Aiyuk is expecting? What's been your take on it?
I think it's just like every other negotiation that this regime with the 49ers has done, right? It feels like every offseason we go through kind of the same routine as fans, where there's a homegrown star that they've drafted that's up for an extension at various positions, right? It started with George Kittle, then it was Fred Warner, then it was Deebo Samuel, and then last offseason it was Nick Bosa, and now it's Brandon Aiyuk. And each player has been well worthy of the extension they deserved. And I think the same goes for Brandon Aiyuk. Homegrown talent, first-round pick, has been fantastic in his role. And his role is different than a lot of the other receivers around the league, right? He's been asked to block. He doesn't get the same number of targets, yet he's been highly efficient. And I'd argue last season was his best as a pro. And so he probably feels like he's deserving of a massive extension. And the wide receiver market has just blown up, right? And now you've got Justin Jefferson's deal kicking in, which has just completely blown the top off of the wide receiver market. And so I could see why there's a little bit of, contention between the two sides. And this is how the 49ers operate. They say, what's the urgency right now? What's the deadline, right? Is it training camp? Is it preseason? Is it week one? And they just continue to just negotiated. And you and I both know this, that Parag Marathe and that front office group is an extremely tough negotiating group. And, we've heard some of the things that they've told players or that they've offered players and kind of where they start. And, it's a business, but it gets personal sometimes. And I think Brandon Aiyuk definitely was feeling like, oh man, definitely not getting offers in the neighborhood of what I'm looking for. And on top of that, I just don't feel valued. And last offseason, or a couple off seasons ago, Deebo Samuel went the other route where he took to social media and, was making more of a public, putting it out there that, hey, they don't want me back and I don't want to be there and blah, blah, blah. And Brandon Aiyuk is just like, I'm not requesting a trade. I just want to meet with you guys. Let's kind of get this cleared up. Let's get on the same page. Let's try to get a deal done. And hopefully that happens over the next 6 weeks. And my stance kind of throughout all of this is that I think we're going to end up getting a Brandon Aiyuk extension eventually. I don't know when that's going to happen. Maybe that's sometime during training camp, early preseason, something like that. But I just imagine Aiyuk, being a part of this team. I think it's a player that Shanahan really covets. It's a player that they've molded and really fits this culture, fits what they're looking for in offense, kind of where they're trying to go with Brock Purdy and into more of a drop back passing offense with guys that can separate down the field, right? They drafted Ricky Pearsall for that, and Brandon Aiyuk fits that exactly. And you kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together, and you kind of see Deebo Samuel maybe in a year not being on this team and them really wanting to contend for the Super Bowl again this year. It just makes too much sense to keep Aiyuk around, and I think they reach a point where they get an extension done. And that's kind of been my stance, and I've just tried to stay away from all the stuff that's been happening in between, because we've seen that now 4 or 5 off seasons in a row that there's just no reason to freak out.
Yeah, I agree. I have maintained that they will extend Brandon Aiyuk. I think eventually they're going to find a nice middle ground. I would assume if I'm Brandon Aiyuk, I look at that Amon-Ra St. Brown deal and I go,
exactly,
that's the one that I think that I deserve. And maybe I don't know what the holdup is. If I'm a team and a player comes to me and has an AAV in mind, like, to me, that's the easier thing to meet than guaranteed money. So, I don't know where the disconnect is between the two. Like I said, I think AAV is easier to overcome than guaranteed money. And so, but I agree with you. I think with what Brock Purdy showed last season, I think Shanahan is finally comfortable saying, I have a quarterback that can operate a drop back passing game more similar to what I had in Atlanta with Matt Ryan. And then you look at what they built there, right, where they had Julio Jones. I'm not saying that Brandon Aiyuk is Julio Jones. He's not, but he is more of a traditional X receiver than Deebo Samuel. And then you just kind of build it out from there, and you say, all right, well, we've got Deebo, who can play this jack of all trades role. We've got Juwan Jennings, who is a third down monster. We bring in Ricky Pearsall, who we can put in the slot. We can do more 11 personnel, which I think is something that we're going to see more of, which is why they made Juszczyk take such a massive pay cut, and he was willing to do it. I don't think he's going to be on the field as much as he used to. I think they have to evolve this passing game to where you don't get the same situation that you did in the second half of the Super Bowl, where this team goes to press man and all of a sudden you're stuck. Your offense can't go anywhere because you've got a game plan that focused more on Deebo, and you need guys that can get open against press man. And that's where Aiyuk is. That's what Ricky Pearsall is. That's just not Deebo's game, which is to say, again, he's an amazing football player. I just think this is probably his last season. And I think they are going to build an offense around Brock Purdy, because they're going to have to pay Brock Purdy after this season. And so, again, as much as, we talk about this team being a run first team, I don't disagree that it isn't. I'm not saying it's not, but it's been a run first team because Kyle Shanahan hasn't had a quarterback that he's trusted since he's been here. Now that he does, I think we see a change. And so I agree with you. I think Aiyuk gets done. He is more of a true number one wide receiver in the more traditional role than Deebo Samuel is. And so, and I have no doubt that Parag can craft a contract that really probably lowers Brandon Ayuk's cap hit this year even more, and sets it up to where again, it's not something that's painful as you probably, again, get rid of Deebo Samuel. That moves me on to my my next question. And we talked a little bit about him already. Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy is entering a very important season for him when it comes to his future earnings in the NFL. Coming off a season as FedEx Air Player of the Year at the quarterback position, an MVP candidate. Do you feel like Brock Purdy coming into an offseason where he had a full offseason to focus on football and not rehab? Do you feel like Purdy is primed for growth, or do you think we see a regression in him just because what he did last season was so incredible? It's almost like, how do you build upon that?
It's true. And I think the further we've gotten away from last season, I think you kind of forget how well he played. And you go back and watch some of the games, and he operated the offense so smoothly. You go back, look at some of the numbers, and 49ers, at least offensively, in terms of a lot of the efficiency metrics, were number one or number two in basically every category. And Brock Purdy was a huge reason why. And so I actually think there's going to be room for growth this season. I think, just like you mentioned, right, they've had a full offseason to just focus on football. And we forget sometimes that Brock Purdy's only played in like a season and a half as a starting quarterback. And so sometimes we just think he's like this veteran who's played in a bunch of games, and he's only played in like 20 some odd games. And so I think he's just going to get better with experience. I think a lot of it is going to be mental, right? We often talk about what his physical limitations are, but I think on the flip side, he's just going to grow from like a cerebral standpoint, and all the experience he's had, the reps he's had, and in just working with Kyle Shanahan, this offensive staff. Hopefully there's more, trust, like you mentioned, in terms of making checks at the line of scrimmage, putting, his guys in more favorable positions, knowing, more where to go with the ball more consistently. It felt like he knew where to do that a lot last season. And if he's able to even take that one step further, the offense is only going to take, another leap forward. So I think there's there's a lot of room for growth in his game. And maybe we don't see that necessarily in his numbers, right? It doesn't mean he's going to just take like this leap in touchdowns or yards or whatever. But I think just in terms of his comfort operating the offense and watching him play, I think there's going to be, definitely a step forward, I think. And that's where this 49ers team is kind of headed, right? They're going to be, if they choose to pay him after the season or in 2 years or whatever, there's going to be a lot more on his plate, just given how the salary is going to be allocated. And so they're going to be depending on him to take steps forward if they want to continue to be a contender. And so, but I think he's capable of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think he's primed for regression, because I think a lot of what he's good at is translatable year over year over year, right? Like exactly. I don't feel like, I don't feel like his numbers last season were largely due to, just being a cog in this machine. There were times where, I guess his escapability, I think, is underrated. And I think we're going to see more of that, like we saw against the Lions, where he's picking things up with his legs and things like that. I think he's more confident in that. And I think Shanahan is going to kind of loosen the reins a little bit. Just his ability to play off script a little bit. Right. All of that just gets even more ingrained as he gets more reps. Like you said, it's hard to look at what he did last year and realize, like, hey, he's got 20 starts under his belt. It's not a lot, and the numbers that he put up, and again, this offense is still going to run through Christian McCaffrey. As long as Christian McCaffrey is here, Kyle Shanahan is going to run the system, the offense through him, because it's literally the favorite toy he's ever gotten in any stop, I think, is Christian McCaffrey. But so I don't know that you're going to see like a spike in numbers. I don't think he's going to throw for, 1,000 more yards than he did last season. You may see his touchdowns go up. You may even see his interceptions go up a little bit. But I don't think in terms of numbers, I don't think we're going to see a big spike or a big regression. I just think that you're going to see, for me at least, even more comfortable game in and game out going, we've got Brock Purdy under center. I'm confident that this offense is going to, is going to put up 20, 24 to 30 points every game.
Absolutely.
Are there going to be games where they don't? Well, most likely, right? Just because, again, it is, we'll stay on this side of the ball for the next question. But I do think that the one thing that wasn't addressed in the offseason was the offensive line. And it tells me that we as fans are more worried about it than the coaching staff is, and whether we'll see who was right. But the one question that I have that I don't think I can answer, and I don't know if there's going to be no definitive answer, but where do you stand on the offensive line going into 2024? And do you think that group specifically is the biggest hurdle to hoisting the Lombardi for the 6th time?
It's funny because I think it's just an organizational philosophy under Kyle Shanahan, John Lynch, is that offensively they just tend to value the guys that touch the ball, right? I think Chris Forster spoke maybe a month ago.
He did,
and kind of alluded to this. And he basically said, when we go into a draft and we've got, the day 1, day 2 picks, generally we're looking at taking guys that are going to touch the ball, right? Skill guys, because we believe they're going to have more of an impact, and we believe in coaching up day 3 picks along the offensive line. Like, we can take a 4th round or 5th round guard and coach him up and make him, serviceable along the offensive line. But he's like, we're less likely to do that with like a wide receiver. So might as well go spend those day 1, day 2 picks on a receiver, or running back, or whatever the case is. And I think his example was like, hey, we can throw a screen to Deebo Samuel and the, right tackle can get blown up. Right. And Deebo Samuel can take that to the house and no one will ever know that the right tackle got blown up. But in reverse, it doesn't work, right? If, the right tackle wins the rep, but the receiver can't break tackles or whatever, then everyone's just like has their hands up in the air. So I understand what they're saying. And now we've watched this kind of franchise or this regime over the last 7-8 years. And it's kind of become evident that this is how they're going to operate. They're going to go with, flyers on the offensive line. They're going to take day 3 guys. They're going to find bargain bin signings as long as they have a Trent Williams or a stalwart.
Right.
And they're just going to piecemeal the rest of it and trust Chris Forster and that coaching staff to coach them up, and trust the rest of the offensive coaching staff to kind of just scheme around it, right? And spend their capital with the skill guys. And ultimately, I know we focus a lot on it, and there's a couple plays in the Super Bowl that might have cost them, right? Spencer Burford and Colton McKivitz mixing up protection or whatever went down there in the Super Bowl. But for the large part, I thought their offensive line was serviceable, and their offense was fantastic last season. Yeah. So clearly, whatever they thought over a 17-game sample worked, and in certain plays, it just tends to get magnified because embarrassingly a McKivitz or a Burford or someone just gives up a pressure, or someone gets blown up, and that clip goes viral on social media, and that's what everyone focuses on. They're like, oh my god, look at this, the offensive line can't do anything. But I just don't think that's the case. I hope it isn't the reason that they win a Super Bowl. I don't think it has been so far. I think it's always easy to point to one thing, but it's never one thing. It's always a combination of multiple things. And there's a multitude of things for why they haven't won the 2 Super Bowls, and offensive line is among them, but I don't think it's the biggest reason, and I don't think it's going to be the single thing that keeps them from winning one in the future. So hopefully they hit on Dominic Pooney this season. Hopefully he's able to kind of step in, and they're able to, Trent Williams stays healthy, and that offensive line kind of just maintains. Yeah, that's a big one. They just maintain their level of play from last season, and I think the offense is going to be just fine.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue going into 2024, they're in a better spot than they were going into 2023, because at right guard, you've got John Feliciano, who is steady and played really well, but you've also got this promising young rookie who, could do well enough in camp and in preseason to supplant Feliciano. And now you've got Feliciano as a backup at all 3 interior spots, which is not a bad spot to be in. I agree with you. I think we tend to overblow the O-line because of situations like, Spencer Burford messing up an assignment, which ends up, costing them points, and then the Chiefs go down the field and end the game. And you just point to that and you go, well, see, like, if Burford was better or whatever, right? And it's like, Burford is fine. He just mentally is not where he needs to be, and that's the biggest issue. It's interesting because we talk about how well Brock Purdy played last season and the numbers he put up, and then you look at things like ESPN's pass block win rate, and the 49ers I think were 26th
You're in the
20s.
NFL. Yeah,
they were in the 20s. Yeah, and you're like, well, imagine what they could do if they were in like the top 15, right? And now all of a sudden you think, hey, could this offense take off even more if the O-line was a little bit better? And I think part of it is, again, it's also philosophy in the players that they go for. Exactly. They go for players that have versatility along the offensive line. And a lot of times you're not going to end up with guys that are just superstars at tackle because they want it, it fits the zone blocking scheme better. And so I don't know that under Kyle Shanahan, you would ever have an offensive line that was top 15 in pass block win rate, because that's not the way they build the line. And so it's just a matter of, can we eliminate some of those mental errors that have plagued us in the postseason? And, there's not a whole lot you could do about that. You're not going to draft a guy that you're like, this guy will never have a mental error, right?
Exactly.
It is, it is easy to point to for fans, because when the offensive line messes up, it's easy to see. It's immediate.
It's super
immediately in your, it's super obvious. And so I think that's where a lot of fans go, see, look, I can see that. Whereas, Deebo Samuel not running the right route, or Deebo Samuel not putting full effort into a route, or Brandon Aiyuk not, although I haven't really seen Brandon Aiyuk do that. He hasn't, at least not since he got out of the doghouse. So I agree with you. I don't think it's the biggest hurdle. It is a concern, because it's always a concern, especially when you can argue that the success of that line hinges on a 36-year-old left tackle, and you never know when Father Time is going to catch up. But so far, it hasn't really shown any sign of slowing down. So I think as long as you've got Big Trent there on the left, I think this offensive line will be good enough. And then if Pooney becomes a guy, like, now all of a sudden, hey, it's more than good enough, it's good, right? And so, and we'll see with Brendel. I think that's a spot that they could have stood to upgrade. They chose not to, but I think they've also got some guys in-house that I think they're looking at to possibly take Brendel's place. Not next season, obviously, but seasons in the future. Yeah. So let's switch to the other side of the ball. We've talked a lot of offense. Al's biggest concern heading into the season is on the defensive side of the ball, most specifically stopping the run, which they were horrendous at. They fire Steve Wilkes. They hire Nick Sorensen as the defensive coordinator, or the defensive play caller, if you will. But they also bring in Brandon Staley as he's associate head coach, co-head coach, whatever you want to call it. But it's just this umbrella, like, defense, right? Like, not even specific to position groups or anything like that. One of the reasons they say that they brought Sorensen in, or hired Sorensen, is because he's been there long enough that he understands kind of the DNA of the defense. He's been there under Saleh. He was there under Ryans, right? It's a familiar guy. He's going to be on the sidelines. He brings some of that energy. He's a younger guy, like Ryans, like Saleh. Do you feel like the defense is going to bounce back under Sorensen and Staley, even though they don't necessarily have some of what we've come to expect from this 49ers defense, which is just an absolutely ass-kicking defensive line and a phenomenal linebacking core, and then kind of pieced it together on the back end, where now it feels like the secondary is arguably the strongest position group on the defensive side of the ball, especially with Greenlaw coming back from that Achilles injury. Where do you think this defense ends up when it's all said and done?
That's an interesting question, and one that I've definitely gone back and forth on. And I think let's start with the Nick Sorensen hire. I think ultimately it's Kyle Shanahan's defense.
Sure.
I know we joke about it all the time, and ultimately, he interviewed Spagnuolo's right-hand guy, spoke to defensive coordinators or other defensive guys that maybe come from different backgrounds or other, defense. They worked for different defensive coordinators outside of this like Seattle system. And then ultimately just kind of chose to stick with it as other teams across the league kind of pivot away from that defensive scheme. And so ultimately it felt like he was just looking for someone to just basically do what maybe Saleh or Ryans was doing and just try to do that again next season.
Right.
And so it made sense why they kept Nick Sorensen. He has a familiarity working with the players, listening to a bunch of the guys talk during OTAs. They spoke highly of him. So
they like him. Yeah, for sure.
They like him as a guy. And so I feel fairly optimistic. I just don't know schematically how good he's going to be. Right. Because that was the one big plus with D'Amico Ryans that you saw immediately when they switched from Saleh to Ryans is that he just had a schematic advantage, whether that was finding one-on-one matchups for pass rushers or, isolating, Fred Warner on blitzes or whatever the case was. It felt like he always had an answer for what the offense was doing. And
brilliant defensive mind.
Exactly. And Wilkes was lacking that last season among many other things. And so with Sorensen, is he going to have that element? I don't know. We'll see, I guess. But I'm optimistic because the guys on defense seem to be, speaking well of him compared to Wilkes, and I think they're going to kind of get back to their roots. But personnel-wise is probably where just my concern is, just because they're not maybe as talented as they have been in past years, just in terms of like they've got more like middle-class depth, if that makes sense, through the draft, and they've added some guy. They replaced Armstead with like a bunch of names, right? Jordan Elliott, Yetur Gross-Matos,
Malik
Collins, right? So it feels like they got more like middle-class depth, but not just maybe like top-heavy dudes. And so I don't know how that's going to translate into just how they play the season. They're really banking on Devondre Campbell, in the early part of the season, staying healthy. He looked a step slow, and I don't know if that's because of what happened in Green Bay or if he's just getting older, but they're banking on him being the number 2 guy next to Fred Warner. And that's the big shoes to fill with Dre Greenlaw, who's a really, really good player. And then defensive line-wise, you're asking a lot of young guys to step up, a lot of guys that have been, in other places to come in and have an impact, both, stopping the run and being effective rushing the passer. And then, like you mentioned, I think the secondary is the strength of this defense, but it banks on health, right? It banks on, Mooney Ward's health, Diamador Lenore's health. We'll see what Renardo Green, the rookie, does. And then in the back end, with Talanoa Hufunga's health, right, coming off the ACL. Like, how's he going to look? Speed was never his best trait before the injury, and now how's he going to look post-injury? And so personnel-wise, I feel like is where I have more questions with that defense. And I think ultimately they're pivoting away from, maybe in 2019, 2020, they were a defensive-led team, and last season they were an offensive-led team, and I think that's what they're trending towards. And now the question is, can their defense just be like top 10 and then be situationally good in the red zone in certain spots to just be, like a top 10 level defense? Because I don't know if they on paper are going to be like a top 2 or 3 defense. I just not quite sure.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. PFF put out an article this week, and they actually ranked the 49ers defensive line as the second best in the NFL. And I thought that was surprising, specifically because there's so many new faces that it's hard to determine right now, like what the rotations will be.
Exactly.
I think
who's going to be inside, outside.
Right. Exactly. And, Al and I have talked about this, it really feels like they made a concerted effort to get back to kind of where they were under D'Amico Ryans in 2022 and 2021 and 2022, where on that defensive line, you had Nick Bosa, right? And you had Eric Armstead. But then outside of that, you just had a bunch of dudes that were good at one thing or good at a couple things that were just rotating in and out and in and out, and fresh legs. And that's where you get guys like Charles Omenihu, you get guys like Samson Ebukam, you get guys like who's the hero in Green Bay?
Farrell.
Cleveland Farrell last year.
Jordan Willis.
Thank you. That's who I was trying to figure out. And so it feels like they went back kind of that direction where they've got Nick Bosa and they've got Javon Hargrave, hopefully, who can kind of get back
Right.
to the Javon Hargrave of the 2022 Eagles. You know, he had a bit of a down year last year, and I think he has said that himself. Right. So, but then you've got guys like Malik Collins, right? Who, when you look at just straight up production numbers, matched Eric Armstead last season. Right. Now, granted, Armstead missed quite a few games and then got into the playoffs and became the Eric Armstead that we grown to love, which was just an absolute game wrecker. I don't expect something like that from Malik Collins, but you've just got a bunch of guys. So again, Malik Collins, Jordan Elliott, you've got Leonard Floyd on the outside, which to me is arguably the best bookend opposite Nick Bosa they've had since D Ford, which I think is a definite upgrade from what they had last year and previous years. But then like you said, you've also got Yetur Gross-Matos, who I think is their new Charles Omenihu, where you're going to have inside-outside versatility. You know, you may have Gross-Matos as your base DN on rundowns to set the edge, and then you flip him inside as a mismatch against guards. So it feels like they're trying to get back to there. And like I said, I do feel like I said the secondary. I'm going to say the cornerback room is probably the best position group on the defensive side now. With Mooney Ward, with Diamador Lenore, with Isaac Yiadom, who had a hell of a year last year and has impressed so far in camp. A guy that they signed, and I think people keep forgetting, Rock Ya-Sin is on the team right now, right? You've got Renardo Green, the second rounder. There's 5 guys right there, which means that to me, we don't have to worry about Ambry Thomas seeing the field anymore. I think his days are numbered, you know, and so as far as depth goes in the cornerback room, it's the deepest it's ever been. Our concern has always been and continues to be those safeties, like you said. Hard to know what you're going to get from Hufanga coming off that ACL, a guy who wasn't known for his athleticism to begin with, and now you're coming back from an ACL tear. That's pretty tough. Jair Brown looked good in spurts last year, and you're really kind of banking on some growth from him. I really like Malik Mustafa, the safety they drafted out of Wake Forest. I think he's going to be very much like Jair Brown. I think we'll see him later in the season as he gets his feet under him. But it'll be interesting to see how he does in the preseason. But I feel like I was one of the only ones that really wasn't upset about the Brandon Staley hire. Mainly because, again, he's not the defensive coordinator, but when he was kind of the hot name bandied about when it was like, who is going to be the defensive coordinator, I understood it and I got it. And I was actually fairly excited about it. A lot of people weren't, based on how things went in San Diego. But if we look at Brandon Staley, just defensive coordinator, right, with the Rams. Now, granted, there's not a lot of tape there, if you will, but he was really, really good. And then, he became the Chargers head coach, and now you just got so much more on your plate that even though he was the defensive play caller, I'm going to give him a bit of a pass, because I think there are only a handful of guys who can weather both being the head coach and the play caller on either side of the ball. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan's really good at it. Andy Reid's really good at it. There aren't a lot of guys that are, right? Bill Belichick, obviously, on the defensive side of the ball. But there aren't a lot of guys who can do both. And so I'm willing to give Staley a pass on that. I'm interested to see what he brings to this team in terms of coverage principles, just ideas, right? Because he's going to bring some of what he learned under Vic Fangio. And I imagine it's going to influence some of those coverage principles. I'm also interested to see, with Dre Greenlaw out, like you said, Devondre Campbell has big shoes to fill. I wonder if we're going to see more 3 safety sets with Greenlaw out until he comes back, just to get better coverage at that spot versus, Devondre Campbell can play the run really well. The last 2 years in Green Bay, he couldn't cover, and that's a big deal, especially in this 49ers defense. So that will be interesting. But I agree with you. This team is an offense-first team now. They were an offense-first team last year. They're going to be an offense-first team this year. I agree with you. And I think that is the correct route to go in the NFL, because defensive performance is volatile year over year. It's hard to rely on defensive performance year after year after year, because it's just difficult. And I think it's almost miraculous that the 49ers defense has been as good as it has been for as long as it has been. That to me is outside the norm. And so as long as if this offense can perform at levels that it performed last season or better, this defense just needs to be like top 15 and they're going to win a lot of games. And so I think just on talent alone, they're top 15. And I think with health, I think they absolutely could be a top 10, if not a top 5 defense. So I'm not as worried about it as Al is, but again, we do need to see them play the run better than they did. And it'll be interesting to see if there's anything different this season than last season to kind of remedy that. Last thing I want to talk about with you, Akash, before we get you on out of here, again, appreciate all your time.
Of course.
Where do you think the rookies fit in on this roster, and specifically Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Cowing, and Isaac Guerendo? The three, to me, the three kind of offensive skill players that I think are most likely to make this team out of camp.
Let's start with the first round guy, Ricky Pearsall. I think he's going to have an impact both offensively and potentially with special teams. And I think, he's been touted as more of this like pro-ready receiver, right? Someone that his route running ability, his ability to separate from defenders was one of his strengths, his strong hands and his like low drop rate. So those are things I feel like translate from the college game to the NFL. And so,
agreed.
Depending on how quickly he's able to pick up the playbook, he should be able to step in and have an impact. And I think you mentioned this earlier in one of our conversations that, the 49ers are going to transition to more 11 personnel this season, which is, 3 wide receivers on the field and just 1 running back. And so I do agree there. I think that was their most efficient personnel grouping last season, both running the ball and throwing the ball.
Yep.
And so I think, they're transitioning away from that 21 personnel with a fullback and a running back and 2 receivers to more of this, spread offense, right? With more receivers on the field and, Debo, Aiyuk, Jennings, who's back on the extension, and then Pearsall. And I think those are going to be the guys that see, a lot of playing time, in my opinion. And I think Pearsall, if he just continues to develop, I think he ends up seeing more and more playing time kind of as the season goes on. Because if you look back at kind of the target shares from last season, the 4th guy last year, who would have been like Ray McLeod, I think he only had less than like 20 targets on the season or 20 catches. I think it wasn't very many. And I'm hoping that because they've invested a lot in Pearsall, and I think he's just a better receiver than McLeod, that he just sees more time on the field. So I expect big things out of him. Jacob Cowing, I know a lot of people I feel like are high on him. I just don't know where he fits in the pecking order, right? You look at the receiver room, it might be the best position group on the team, arguably, right? Just pound for pound talent. And so, like, how does he find playing time on the field would be my big question there with Cowing. And then Isaac Guerendo, I think he, they veered away whenever they veer away from that traditional one cut and go runner, right? They did that with, Ty Davis Price, or they've done that in the past with Trace Sermon. That pick always just seems to fail for whatever reason. The guy, that guy just has not found success in this offense. Yet when they draft the guy that's been more successful in this scheme in college, it just seems to translate way better, which makes a lot of sense, right? Whether that's been an Elijah Mitchell in the past. And I think they're going to kind of get the same thing here with Isaac Guerendo. And I think, Mitchell's injury history, I think they need to find someone that's a reliable number 2 behind Christian McCaffrey, someone that's able to do all 3 things, right? Someone that's able to run the ball, someone that's able to be a receiver out of the backfield, or motion out and, also be a versatile piece and pass protect. And I think that's something
the big one.
That's the big one. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why Jordan Mason doesn't get as much playing time is his lack 100%. Of doing all 3 of those things. And I know a lot of people just are focused on his running ability, but I think for Kyle Shanahan to trust you as a running back, you need to do all 3 of those things well. And if Guerendo's able to do that, I can see him earning those, number 2 spot behind McCaffrey. And so I expect good things out of him this year as well. So I would say those two guys, Pearsall and Garendo, I expect to have more of an impact, at least maybe not in the box score or the stat sheet, but just in terms of, okay, we see them on the field a bunch. They're making some critical plays here and there, more than Cowing.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, Cowing is smaller, right? But like Pearsall, shows no fear going over the middle. And he's also a guy that can take the top off the defense. You know, you look at obviously the top four in that wide receiver room are Debo, Aiyuk, Jennings, and now Pearsall as the first round pick. Right. So you're really looking at that fifth wide receiver who doesn't get a lot of run in the offense anyway. Is a Cowing going to make it over a guy like
Danny Gray?
Let's say, I think he makes it over Danny Gray. I think Danny Gray, like Ambry Thomas, is not long for this roster. But I was going to say Chris Conley, right?
That's right. Chris Conley
is back with the team. Had a really productive Super Bowl, and I think has really earned a lot of respect and trust from Kyle Shanahan. So it'll be interesting to see, like I said, if he can supplant someone like Chris Conley. Otherwise, I think he's probably destined for the practice squad.
And a spot like that comes down to special teams, right? Who
also true,
plays their butt off on kick return or punt return or punt coverage, and ultimately that fifth wide receiver contributes more on special teams than they do on offense, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is Pearsall going to play on special teams? Maybe, but another route for Cowing would be as a punt returner, I think. And then to bring up special teams, every single mock that I did, whether it was just by myself or Alan, I did a couple, I always found a way to get Isaac Garendo on the 49ers. The minute that he ran, a 4-3, what was it, 4-3-2, something along those lines.
4-3-3.
I was like, oh my God, Kyle Shanahan is going to love this guy. But to me, I think the secret, I don't want to call it the secret weapon, but I think the secret way that Isaac Garendo affects the 2024 season is as the kickoff returner. I think kickoff returns are going to make a big comeback in the NFL with these new rules. And I think Isaac Garendo is a perfect player to take advantage of that. Now, I also think Deebo Samuel is, but whether or not they want to put Deebo Samuel in position to possibly get injured on a kickoff return, I'm not sure. Maybe in a must-win game, or maybe in the playoffs, you might see something like that, because obviously Deebo would be elite at that with the ball in his hands. But I think, like I said, I think Garendo is a perfect player to fit that role, just with the speed. He has handled kickoffs at Louisville in the past, and I just think that is going to be a way that we look up at the end of the season and go, oh, damn, Isaac Garendo had 2 kickoff returns for a touchdown or something along those lines, where you're like, hey, that was a great pickup. Not even speaking of, his ability in the run game. You've got, if you've got CMC, Elijah Mitchell, and Isaac Garendo as your top 3 backs, right? You've got speed on top of speed on top of speed. Like that's going to be difficult to defend. And the thing that you pointed out that I love Jordan Mason. I do. I love the way that he runs the ball, but I've said till I was blue in the face, he cannot pass protect. And it's why he doesn't get on the field more. Everyone's like, why isn't Mason? And because he can't pass protect. And if you can't pass protect, you're not getting on the field. Garendo, when you look at any of his scouting profiles, that is one of the things that most scouts point out is his ability in pass protection, which I think was another big check mark for the 49ers. So I'm excited about all 3 guys. I don't know if Cowing makes the team. I think that he could. I think there's a way that, an avenue for him, especially as a punt returner, but it'll just be interesting to see how things go in camp. And then outside of those rookies, Pooney is going to make the team. I don't think there's really any question of that. And I also think Malik Mustafa makes this team as well. And so I do think that the rookies have an ability to affect this 2024 season in a positive way. And I think it was a good class. I wasn't, my initial reaction to Pearsall was negative, simply because I really liked Cooper DeJean was still on the board when they picked, and then also the other wide receiver from AD Mitchell, who I thought Kyle Shanahan would have been obsessed with him, especially since he was from Texas. But then the more film that I looked at with Pearsall and just kind of reading more of his scouting reports, I think he fits in perfectly with what Shanahan wants. I think it's Kyle Shanahan's version of Puka Nacua or even really man, brain fart. Who's the other guy? Their other slot receiver in
Cooper Kupp.
Kupp, thank you, Cooper Kupp. I think that's kind of his thought process when it comes to Pearsall. But if you get Aiyuk and Debo on the outside and Pearsall in the slot in an 11 personnel, that's going to be hell for defenses. And so I'm excited to see. I'm excited to see what happens. But Akash, again, thank you so much for your time, man. Genuinely appreciate it. Let all these people know where they can find you right now. I know that you're not doing too much content, but where can they follow you at least?
Always appreciate you and enjoy talking with you. Especially, I feel like on 49ers social media, you're always one of the super like logical, sensible, statistic-based ones. So I always really enjoy that. So I appreciate you for having me. Yeah, you can find me at Twitter. That's usually where a lot of the content is. I feel like now is kind of the downtime. So I'm sure once we hit preseason, it'll pick right back up. And as a fan, it's you tell yourself, you're like, I'm not going to get as emotionally invested when the season starts. And then the season starts and then you're right back in it. And I know that's exactly what's going to happen. So you can find me at Twitter. It's right there in the video. And yeah, man, appreciate you for having me. Enjoyed talking with you.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Akash. And if you're listening, please, again, rate, review, subscribe. If you're watching us, make sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. We will be back next week, Al and I together, or Al and I solo. We've got vacations. It is the middle of summer. We've got some vacations coming up, but we've got training camp opens in about 4 weeks. So things will ramp up from there. But again, we thank you guys for listening. Appreciate you. And until next time. Later.